chapter 1, which is titled An Inglorious Sunset. The darkest part of night, they say, is the moment just before dawn. For President John Dramani Mahama, however, the darkest hour on Friday, December 9, 2016, started immediately after sunset, a dreadful sign of a long and gloomy night ahead. But he had to brave the emotional odds and face the nation from his official cantonment residence in the nation's capital, Accra. The familiar faces of men and women surrounding him that evening bore expressions that accentuated the gravity of the moment, advertising the melancholy that subdued their beings like a depressing and incurable epidemic. These men and women were the pallbearers of a regime whose sudden demise had just been announced and whose burial would take place a few weeks later by jubilant undertakers on the other side of the political duopoly. They did not speak, but if their minds and bodies were the central processing units, their faces were the monitors on which their thoughts and emotions could be read. These men and women appeared to be standing still, but they were swaying wearily under the heavy weight of indescribable grief. Before they came out to face the cameras, this household was like a graveside, where loyal party faithful wept like mourners who had gone to bury a breadwinner in the prime of his or her life. Tears, like rivers that had burst their banks, flowed freely for different reasons. These politicians ought not to have been grieving if one took them by their words. They had sworn to serve. They had spoken of the sacrifices they made for the nation, even to the detriment of their own happiness and those of their families, if they were to be believed. So when the voters decided to give them rest from their labor by lifting the burden of the nation from their aching shoulders, they should have been rejoicing before the cameras. They should have heaved a collective sigh of relief that they could now have their privacy, that party members would not harass them for jobs and fees and medical bills and dowries and funeral donations, that the nation's intrusive media would not rudely wake them up with probing questions that embarrass them or dumb questions that anger them. They should have been happy that they would not be blamed for all the woes of the country, including the inability of some men to satisfy their wives. Let me repeat that bit. They should have been happy that they would not be blamed for all the woes of the country, including the inability of some men to satisfy their wives. Now, their faces told a different story, a story of grief, not relief, and the reason was not difficult to find. Apart from those of their lot who would be returning to Parliament, they would now relinquish the hallowed title Honourable and forfeit the endless opportunities and possibilities that came with it. They could no longer dictate who got what contract or decide who got what job. Some would still ride in Toyota Land Cruisers and other V8 vehicles they had acquired or would acquire by virtue of the political positions they had occupied. But they would now fuel them at their own expense. Their drivers would now not be able to leave the engines of those heavy fuel guzzlers humming for hours while their bosses were locked up somewhere for business or pleasure. Now, the V8, especially the Toyota Land Cruiser, has come to symbolize power. It was synonymous with being an honorable. To drive or ride in a Toyota Land Cruiser meant you were free to disregard or break all the road traffic laws in Ghana and still have police officers and other traffic regulators on duty salute you as you passed. It's a practice and a sense of entitlement among the political elite as old as independent Ghana. John Dramani Mahama, whose father was an MP and Minister of State in Ghana's First Republic, makes this observation in his book, My First Coup d'etat and Other Stories from Last Decades of Africa. Quote, "Whenever we heard Salifo, the watchman, opening the gate to let our father's car in, we would all stop whatever we were doing so we could run outside to greet him. Like most of the ministers of state, members of parliament, and other politicians from Dr. Nkrumah's time, our father drove a Mercedes-Benz 220. They all loved those cars. So many of them owned those Benzes that it was like the unofficial official car. It came with status. Whenever people saw a Benz approaching, they took notice because they knew whoever was inside the car had to be a big man, an important somebody." End quote. Thank you.